I've been a nurse for over 10 years, and for the last year I've been working at a very old hospital, the kind of place that was once modern, but now has a peculiar smell of mold and creaking walls. I was going through a tough time in my personal life, with little rest and a lot of emotional weight building up. The hospital, especially during the night shift, had this lonely vibe. You know, those dead hours, when you're alone in dimly lit hallways, and the silence seems to stretch on forever. During my first week working the night shift, I noticed that the building seemed alive in some way. Something about the energy in that place made my skin crawl, but for some reason I still managed to ignore it, until I started hearing the whispers. I was doing a round, as usual, walking down the empty corridors. The weak light from the lamps flickered, and the sounds of the building seemed to intensify at night. The creaking pipes, the echoes of doors closing, the wind passing through the broken windows. But there was one sound that night I just couldn't ignore. At first, I thought it was someone from the cleaning crew or maybe a delirious patient, but the sound didn't come from anywhere in particular. It seemed to move from one side to the other, like it was a conversation in whispers, but very distant. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to figure out where it was coming from, until reality hit me. I was the only person on that floor. I tried to shake it off. I mean, hospitals are old, and they have their quirks, old pipes, creaky floors, all that jazz. But the whispers kept coming back, and they weren't just soft anymore, they were personal. I began to hear them more often during my shifts. They started to call out things that felt oddly familiar, like they were addressing me directly. At first, I thought it was the exhaustion, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me. But it wasn't just in my head. I swear I could hear my name, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the hallways, late at night. It was always the same time, around 2 a.m., when the rest of the world was asleep, and the only sound was the hum of fluorescent lights. I began to feel the hair on my neck stand up every time the clock struck that hour. It was around the third or fourth night when I decided to do something about it. I thought maybe I'd just check the place out, make sure there was no one hiding in the back hallways playing pranks on me or something. So I grabbed my flashlight and started walking. The halls were as empty as ever, and everything was quiet, too quiet. I checked the rooms, but they were all locked up tight, the patients either asleep or in the ICU, too far from where I was. That's when I heard it again. My name. So clear now, as though someone was standing right behind me. I froze in my tracks, the hairs on my arms tingling. I turned around, my flashlight flicking over the empty space, but there was nothing there. I took a deep breath and tried to laugh it off, but my heart was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The more I worked the night shift, the more I noticed the cold spots. At first, they were just annoying, like walking into a room where the air conditioning had been turned up too high. But as the days passed, they became more pronounced. One night, I was in the morgue, filing paperwork, when I suddenly felt the temperature drop drastically. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, makes you feel heavy, like something's pressing down on your chest. I checked the thermostat, but it was set at a comfortable 72 degrees. Nothing explained it. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but the cold kept crawling under my skin, and then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. But that wasn't the end of it. As I was walking back to the nurse's station, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow darting across the hallway. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped and scanned the corridor, but again, there was nothing. I was the only one on duty that night. It happened again a few nights later. This time, I could swear I saw a figure, but when I looked directly, it vanished. This was no ordinary shadow, though. It was different. Like the darkness itself was alive, shifting around me, almost teasing me. I started to dread those nights, waiting for the moment when that shadow would show itself again. The worst part, though, it was always near the same room, the room at the end of the hall. I don't know why, but it gave me a sense of dread every time I passed it. The air in front of it was always colder than the rest of the hallway, and the closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. It was room 311, the old isolation room. I don't know why, but I could never seem to get rid of the feeling that someone, was inside. Sometimes the door would creak open just a little, and I'd hear faint whispers, too soft to understand, but clear enough to know they weren't coming from my imagination. I tried to ignore it, but every time it felt like something was pulling me toward that door, urging me to open it, just to see. One night I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on in that room. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob, my breath catching in my throat. The door opened with a long, drawn-out groan, and I stepped inside, trying to calm my nerves. The room was freezing, colder than any other place in the hospital. I could see my breath fogging in the air. It looked like just another empty room, but something was off. There was a pressure in the air, a heaviness that made it hard to breathe. As I scanned the room with my flashlight, I froze. At the far corner by the window, something was standing. It wasn't a person, though. It was more like a shadow, but not quite. It was shifting, like it was made of the darkness itself. I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadow moved again, this time closer, and I could feel it, like it was pulling me into its depths. The temperature dropped even further, and my breath started coming out in visible puffs, but not from the cold. It was the fear, the kind of fear that sinks into your bones and makes every instinct scream for you to run. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, watching as the shadow drew nearer, its form becoming clearer. I could almost make out features, faint, blurry, but definitely there. And then it whispered. The whisper wasn't just a random sound anymore. It felt intentional, directed at me. "Get out!" it hissed, the voice cold and eerie, like it came from the very walls. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back, finally snapping out of the trance-like state I had been in. My legs felt weak, and I nearly tripped over my own feet as I ran out of that room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I could barely catch my breath. I didn't stop running until I was back at the nurse's station, my hands shaking as I gripped the counter. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just tired, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was in that room, something that didn't belong. For the next few nights, I stayed away from room 311. I tried to focus on my rounds, keep my mind occupied, but it wasn't the same. The whispers still followed me, always just out of reach, like they were lurking in the corners of my vision. The cold spots became more frequent, and now I could feel them creeping up on me at odd moments. I'd be walking through the hallways, and suddenly I'd be hit with an icy chill, like someone was standing right behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Every creak of the building, every flicker of light, sent me into a state of heightened anxiety. I couldn't relax. I couldn't sleep. And then, one night, it happened again. I had just finished checking on a patient in the ICU when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the hallway. At first, I thought it was another nurse, or maybe a doctor walking the rounds. But when I stepped out into the hall, no one was there. The footsteps continued, like someone was walking toward me. My heart hammered in my chest as I turned around, and that's when I saw it, just for a split second. A figure walking toward me, tall and thin, draped in a long, dark coat. It wasn't any of the doctors or nurses I recognized. This person, if that's what it was completely unfamiliar. Their face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I called out to them, but there was no answer, no response, just those slow, rhythmic steps getting louder. And then, as if they had never existed, the figure vanished into thin air. I froze, my mind racing. Was I hallucinating? My body felt like lead, unable to move, as if I was trapped in some nightmare. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. I turned back toward the ICU, feeling the oppressive weight of the air around me, the sensation that I wasn't alone. That's when I noticed it. A faint, cold breath against the back of my neck. I spun around, expecting to see someone there, but again, there was nothing. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't reason it away. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I was in over my head. I didn't tell anyone at first. Who would believe me? I kept my mouth shut, pretending everything was normal, but the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. The whispers started following me home. I'd be lying in bed, trying to sleep, and I'd hear them faintly, just beyond the edge of my consciousness, calling my name in the darkness. I'd jerk awake, heart racing, convinced I was still at the hospital. I was losing touch with reality. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't think straight, and I was beginning to question everything. Was I being haunted? Was there something in that building, something old and dark, that I wasn't supposed to know about? It wasn't until a week later that I started talking to some of the older nurses. I needed to know if anyone else had experienced what I had been going through. I casually brought it up one night, over a cup of coffee in the break room, trying to sound nonchalant. Has anyone ever noticed anything strange happening around here? Like cold spots or noises? I asked, my voice low. At first, the others just shrugged it off, muttering about the usual hospital quirks. Old pipes, faulty air conditioning. But then, one of the senior nurses, Karen, looked at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "What are you really asking?" she said, her tone suddenly serious. I hesitated. I don't know. I guess I'm just curious. I've been hearing things. Whispering, footsteps, that kind of thing. And I felt these cold spots that come out of nowhere. I know it sounds crazy, but my words trailed off as Karen leaned forward. "It's not crazy," she said quietly. "This place has a long history. You're not the first to hear things or see things. You just don't talk about it. At least, not until it becomes too much to ignore." Her eyes were cold, but there was a weariness there too, like she had seen it all before. I leaned in, suddenly desperate for answers. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" She sighed and looked around the room, as if making sure no one else was listening. "Some of the rooms here, they've seen things, strange things. The old parts of this hospital, especially the isolation ward, there's something about them. People hear voices, feel like they're being watched. But no one talks about it, not in front of the doctors or the administration. If you do, you're labeled as crazy and they find a reason to get rid of you." Karen's voice dropped to a whisper, and she leaned in even closer. "But if you really want to know, you'll have to figure it out for yourself. Just don't go poking around in room 311. Trust me, you don't want to." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Room 311, the room I had already had an unsettling encounter with. "What's so bad about room 311? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Karen gave me a long, knowing look, and then she stood up. "I'm not going to get into it," she said, "but I'll tell you this much. There's something in that room, something old, and it doesn't. Like when people interfere with its space." I spent the rest of that night thinking about what Karen had said. What did she mean by something old? And why had she been so adamant about not going near that room? I couldn't help it. My curiosity was burning now. I needed answers. So, that night, I made a decision. I was going to find out what was really going on in room 311, whether I was ready for it or not. Later that night, I waited until the rest of the staff had settled into their routines. Most of the nurses were already busy with their tasks, and I knew I could sneak away unnoticed for a little while. My heart was pounding as I made my way down the hall toward room 311. I tried to ignore the feeling that the air had shifted, that the building was somehow holding its breath. The hallway seemed longer, darker than usual, and the faint buzzing of the overhead lights made everything feel even more oppressive. As I approached the door, I could feel it. The cold. It was like a wall of ice surrounding the room. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath fogging in front of me, and I instinctively wrapped my arms around myself to ward off the chill. My fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob, and I took a deep breath before pushing the door open. The sound it made as it creaked on its hinges was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Inside, the room was exactly as I remembered it from my previous visit. Empty, except for the faint glow of moonlight streaming in through the broken window. But something was different this time. There was an undeniable presence in the room, a weight in the air that made it feel like I was intruding. The whispers were back, but they were louder now, more distinct, and they seemed to be coming from all directions. My heart raced, but I forced myself to step inside, determined to uncover the truth. I shone my flashlight around the room, the beam flicking over the walls, the old peeling paint, and the remnants of what looked like old medical equipment. But then something caught my eye. On the far wall, there was a small, almost hidden door. I had never noticed it before. It was too small to be a closet, and it seemed out of place. My curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly approached it, my breath coming faster now. The whispers grew louder, as though they were urging me on. I reached for the handle, and when I turned it, the door creaked open with a sound that made my stomach turn. Beyond the doctor was a narrow, dark staircase leading down into the basement. The air down there was thick and musty, and I could feel the temperature drop even more as I stepped onto the first stair. I hesitated for a moment, but then the whispers seemed to grow more insistent, pushing me forward. I descended carefully, my flashlight shaking in my hand, illuminating the way down. The further I went, the more I felt like I was being watched. The sense of dread grew heavier with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. The walls were covered in old yellowed paper, and there was a strange smell in the air, like damp earth mixed with something metallic. My heart raced as I scanned the room. There was nothing there at first, but then my flashlight fell on something that made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the room, there was a small, dusty bed, and on it lay an old, tattered hospital gown. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, yet something about it felt wrong. I stepped closer, my stomach turning as I realized that the gown was stained with something dark, something that didn't look like it belonged in a hospital. Before I could react, the whispers came again, this time clearer, louder, more insistent than ever. "Leave! Now!" they hissed, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, my eyes fixed on the gown. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the temperature in the room plummeted even further. I could see my breath fogging in front of me again, and my skin prickled with the sensation of something watching me. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that was happening, but it was as if my body wasn't my own anymore. My legs wouldn't move, my chest tightened, and I felt as though I couldn't breathe. The whispers were now all around me, filling my head, and I could swear I felt a cold hand on the back of my neck, just hovering there as if someone, or something, was standing right behind me. I managed to force myself to turn around, and that's when I saw it. There, in the dim light of my flashlight, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was tall, too tall for a person, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. The face was obscured, hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, drilling into me. The whispers seemed to grow louder, like they were coming from the figure itself. It was almost as if the air had thickened around me, making it harder to breathe, as though the very presence of this thing was suffocating me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was paralyzed by fear, every part of me telling me to run, to get out, but my body refused to obey. The figure didn't move at first, just stood there in the doorway, silent. The air grew heavier, colder, and the whispers turned into low, guttural murmurs that I could barely comprehend. It was as if the room was alive. the walls breathing with an unnatural rhythm. My mind was screaming, begging me to leave, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. It was like it had some kind of hold on me, something ancient and powerful that I couldn't escape. And then, in a voice that wasn't a whisper but a sharp, cold hiss, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, its voice echoing in my mind as well as in the room, like it was coming from everywhere. I felt my heart race in my chest, the fear surging through my veins like an electric current. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The figure stepped forward, its long limbs stretching impossibly far, and for a brief moment I saw its face. It was a grotesque, twisted thing, skin stretched tight, eyes black and hollow, staring at me with a hunger that made my stomach churn. I didn't know how much time passed as I stood there, unable to tear my eyes away from the creature. It felt like an eternity, like the world around me had stopped, frozen in time. But eventually, the figure took another step toward me, and something inside me snapped. My legs moved, my body jerked into action, and I bolted for the stairs, not looking back, not caring how loud my footsteps were as I ran up the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the top of the stairs, I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I ran straight through the hallway, through the rooms, not even registering where I was going. My mind was a blur, my heart pounding in my ears. The only thing I could focus on was getting as far away from that basement as possible. It was like my body had taken over, instinctively fleeing from whatever that thing had been. I didn't stop running until I was back in the nurse's station, the door slamming shut behind me, the cold still clinging to my skin. I collapsed into the nearest chair, gasping for breath, trying to calm myself. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, and my mind was racing. What had I seen? What had that thing been? I knew I wasn't imagining it. It was too real, too vivid to be a dream or a hallucination, but I couldn't explain it. And the worst part? I realized that I wasn't alone in the hospital anymore. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were still there, in the back of my mind, lingering like a shadow, calling me, beckoning me to return. But I knew I couldn't. I had seen enough. I was done. The days that followed felt like a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like something was following me everywhere. I went. I couldn't even sleep at home anymore. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind made me jump. And those whispers, they never stopped. They had found their way into my mind, echoing in my thoughts during the day too. It was maddening. I couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't go near room 311 anymore, but I knew that I couldn't let it go either. Something was still there. Something was calling me back. So a week later, I gathered what little courage I had left and decided to go back. I had to. I couldn't live with this constant fear, this nagging feeling that I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand. But this time, I wasn't going in alone. I enlisted Karen's help. I didn't tell her everything I'd seen. How could I? She'd probably think I was losing my mind. But I told her enough to make her agree to come with me. That night, we both slipped into the hospital during the late shift. The halls were as empty as ever, and the silence felt thicker than usual, almost suffocating. We headed straight for room 311. Karen didn't speak much, but I could tell she was uneasy. She had seen the fear in my eyes, and I think she knew that something wasn't right. We reached the door, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The whispers had stopped, and the air felt still, too still. I turned to Karen and she nodded. We were in this together. When we opened the door, I felt it immediately. The cold. It was worse than I remembered, as though the temperature dropped several degrees just by stepping inside. Karen didn't say anything, but I could see her shivering. I led the way to the small door in the corner, the one that led to the basement. I didn't even need to say anything. Karen followed me without hesitation. We both knew what we had to do. We had to go down there and face whatever was waiting for us. As we descended the stairs, I could feel the heaviness in the air, like the walls were closing in on us. The darkness seemed to press against my skin, making it harder to breathe. I tried to focus on the steps in front of me, but it was hard. The whispers had started again, faint at first, then growing louder with each step we took. I turned my head slightly to look at Karen, and I saw her face pale with fear, her eyes wide, scanning the dark space around us. When we reached the bottom, I couldn't help but look around. The room looked the same as it had before, except now there was something different. The bed in the corner, the one I had seen earlier, was gone. In its place was something else, something dark, something that felt wrong. It was a pile of old, torn blankets, and I swear I saw something moving underneath them. I took a step forward, but Karen grabbed my arm. "Don't," she whispered. "It's not safe. We need to leave." But I couldn't. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. They were all around us, filling the room with their voices. I could feel something cold, like a presence, surrounding me, closing in. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short gasps, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the blankets. Slowly, I reached out to touch them, my hand trembling as I moved closer. That's when it happened. The blankets shifted, and something or someone sat up from the pile. A figure shrouded in darkness, its face hidden in the shadows. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel it staring at me, watching me with cold, empty eyes. The whispers turned into a low growl, a sound that vibrated through my chest like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My body was frozen, trapped in place by some unseen force. Karen was beside me, but she looked just as paralyzed, her face pale with fear. The figure moved toward us, its presence pressing down on us like a physical weight. I felt it growing closer, its cold breath brushing against my skin, sending a chill through my entire body. And then, in a voice that wasn't a whisper, but a sharp, echoing command, it said one word: "Leave." The word was like an electric shock, making my body react immediately. I didn't know how, but adrenaline took over, and I was finally able to move. Without thinking twice, I pulled Karen, and we started running for the stairs. Each step was harder than the last, as if the air was becoming denser and heavier, trying to drag us back into that room. The voices, now in a deafening scream, echoed through the walls, making me tremble with fear. I knew we had to get out of there. We didn't have time anymore. When we finally reached the top of the stairs, I breathed a sigh of relief. But the feeling that we were being watched didn't go away. The cold was still with us, enveloping me like a cold cloak, as if that thing hadn't left us, as if it was still following us. But when I looked back, the room was empty. Whatever had been chasing us had disappeared, like it had never existed. We left the hospital that night without saying a word. There was no need. The fear we shared was palpable, and I knew that Karen felt the same as I did, that what happened there couldn't be explained. In the days that followed, I felt like something inside me had changed. The hospital seemed less like a place of healing, and more like a living nightmare, a prison of shadows and echoes. And even though I had left that night alive, I knew I would never be the same. Weeks went by, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. The whispers grew more frequent, clearer, and they weren't confined to the hospital anymore. They followed me into my dreams, whispering words I couldn't understand. I tried to ignore it, but everything seemed to be converging back to what happened that night. I knew that whatever had been awakened in that place was still lurking. Finally, I decided it was time to leave completely. I requested a transfer to another hospital, far away from that cursed place. But before I left, I felt like I needed to do something. I went to the administration, trying to seek answers, trying to understand what really happened in those dark corridors. But all I found was silence. No one knew anything, no explanations, no records. On my last day, as I walked through the hallways one final time, a feeling of sorrow overtook me. I didn't know if it was fear or something else, but I could feel its presence still there. as if the hospital itself was mourning my departure, or perhaps just waiting for something. I went to the door of room 311 for the last time. It was closed, as always, but when I looked through the window, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. The shadow was there. That same distorted figure I had seen months before, standing at the window, watching. And then, one last time, I heard the whispers. "You'll never leave." I froze at the window, staring at the shadow, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew it wasn't just my imagination. It was real. It had followed me. The whispering grew louder, as if the voice was right beside me, urging me to come closer, to return. But I couldn't. I knew I couldn't go back. The darkness that had surrounded room 311, the cold that had clung to me, it was all still there, lingering in the corners of my mind, trying to pull me back. I took one last look at the hospital, feeling a sense of finality settle over me. Whatever had been waiting for me in those hallways, in that room, would have to remain there. I turned away from the window and walked out the door, never looking back. I didn't go back to the hospital. I couldn't. The whispers never truly left me, though. They lingered in the back of my mind, in my dreams, in the quiet moments of my day. I'd catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of my eye, and I'd feel that same icy chill that had once plagued the hospital. It was as if it was following me, waiting for me to return, as if I'd never really escaped. Months passed, and I tried to live a normal life again. I changed hospitals, moved to a different city, hoping the distance would help me forget. But even there, late at night, when the world was quiet and still, I could hear them, the whispers and the shadows. Sometimes when I'd walk down empty hallways, I'd feel that cold, that weight on my chest, and I'd stop in my tracks, convinced that it was there, just out of sight, watching me. I'm telling you this now because I've come to realize something. You can't run from it. Whatever it was in that hospital, whatever force haunted room 311, it doesn't let go. It follows you. It's still out there waiting, watching, whispering, and no matter how far you go, it always finds a way to reach you. I've tried everything, changing hospitals, moving, even therapy, but nothing works. It's still there. And if you ever find yourself walking the halls of an old abandoned hospital late at night, when the air is thick with silence and the whispers start to fill the empty space, you'll know. You'll know that it's waiting for you, just like it was waiting for me.